Hajime!
Ave Legionaries, it's good to talk to you guys again, and just to keep it short, back to the point, we're going to get back to the transmission, part 2 of Selected Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. We're going to talk about more in depth, specifically what it is about Plato's philosophy, its content, its aristocratic content, which is obscured, right? It's obscured by this apologia, this kind of esoteric reading, esotericism, and the exoteric, basically, amenableness of its message. And then later what we're going to do is wrap up, right, because I'm not going to read you the whole book, that'd be absurd. But what's going to happen is we're going to use that as a, let's say, a tether to bring us full circle, to explain how it is that ideologies work, how it is that they obscure their true meaning, the purpose of esoteric versus exoteric literature, and then later, of course, the applications that are fed to us in our time. What does it mean necessarily to have a philosophy which on its surface appears to be left or right, whatever it may be, but in its center is really the preserve of an aristocratic ethos, right? And which ones those are, I mean, obviously I'll postulate those things. It might be a little bit of a conjecture here, right, Legionaries? But also the implications of Platonic philosophy in our time, and how people use it, abuse it, and how it's come to be in contemporary eras. And so without further ado, I want to return to the text, and where we can talk about specifically the way that the argument of Socrates, as relayed to us by Plato, right, in the Gorgias, responds to Callicles. And if you remember specifically from the last episode, Callicles is the unvarnished truth, the man who postulates or makes the assertion that to live a philosophical life is to ultimately live in nature, and ultimately the greatest expression of nature is the might of the best makes right. And if you remember correctly, the delineation between might makes right in this kind of absurd lowbrow sense is not what's implied. He means a totality of a person, not simply this ogre that's just, ham-fisted, Stalin-like individual. So the distinction is important, as I will relate to you later, but let's get back into the text with Dr. Alamaru, and then we'll just break it down from there. Ready, gentlemen? Here we go. All right. So let's get to the section here in Dr. Alamaru's book, and its subsection, Socrates' bizarre replies to Callicles, the radicalization of Calliclean political philosophy, in quotations. And I'm reading Costin now. It is to be seen that Socrates in fact does not challenge any of Callicles' fundamental political orientation. Socrates merely shows that Callicles in his youth is naive about politics. He confuses nomos with politeia, or rather misses the point that ultimately it is physical force and not speech that constitutes political society, and doesn't truly understand the key, the special kind of rhetoric or strategy that will really make philosophy not only safe in the cities, but rule the cities themselves. Callicles' frankness, his parousia, to which Socrates repeatedly refers throughout the Gorgias, is his shortcoming. Callicles is not sufficiently decivilized enough, for he is not learned at the hands of a Chiron in the woods. His teacher has been the urbane orator Gorgias, and not a wild man like Socrates, who is repeatedly called agrokos in his dialogue. He knows neither the lion nor the fox. He's accordingly even still too conventional. He believes too much in the power of words, and clumsily avert words at that. Socrates doesn't just believe in the power of words, but also of force. It was Socrates, not Callicles or Polus, who reminded both that the true power in the cities lies with those who hold a hidden dagger. So Socrates does disagree with Callicles, but it is a disagreement about tactics. It is in any case not the disagreement of the pious moralists that the tradition has held Plato to be in this dialogue. So pause. So just to reiterate what the assertion is being made here. Ultimately, the case is being made that Socrates actually agrees with the substance of Callicles' might makes right rhetoric and philosophical approach to political philosophy, but he is making a critique based on tactics, based on, let's say, youthful recklessness in presentation of such political philosophy being made manifest or basically exalted or articulated. I hope that makes sense, legionaries, but things will clear up as I read through. Now, returning to the text. Now, Socrates' replies to Callicles and the Gorgias are weak and inadequate to the point of absurdity. They lack any power to convince anyone reading this text freshly and without any overbearing prejudice in the favor of Socrates or in favor of conventional morality. Socrates, in a sense, wins the argument, since Callicles is reduced to silence after a certain point. But it is not clear if this victory is merely rhetorical, or even what merely rhetorical would mean in this case. It is not clear why Plato would have Socrates make the arguments he does, or why Socrates would make these in the order that he does to a particular audience, an audience of orators seemingly unwilling to accept any of his premises. Socrates' answer to Callicles' challenge are disjointed and winding. We should therefore keep several key points always in mind when we consider the labyrinthian path on which Socrates takes us, and by no means trust that he is doing what he says he is doing, or what he appears to be doing. We should always keep in mind Callicles' specific claim that the nature of his main concern, and the fact that he doesn't agree with the distinction between the political and philosophical lives as Socrates presents it. What Socrates appears to be doing is clear enough, and everyone who reads this text will at first agree with the traditional interpretations. Socrates seems to be doing what he did earlier with Gorgias and Polus. He seems to be defending justice against the cynical and tyrannical attacks and sophistries of the rhetors. In this argument with Gorgias, Socrates introduced the question of justice at a point at which it was by no means necessary to do so to continue the discussion. Indeed, it was plainly rude on the part of Socrates to embarrass his interlocutor in this way. In his discussion with Polus, Socrates seems again to defend the cause of justice to the extreme against Polus's claims that the art of rhetoric supplies raw power to do what one will, to become a tyrant in one's own city. Now, in his answer to Callicles' radical attacks on the conventional notions of justice, Socrates seems to be doing the same thing. He appears to be defending common justice and decency against the attacks of an extreme and tyrannical man. Socrates appears also, and this is the crux of the ruse, to be allying philosophy on one side with justice, even conventional justice, against, on the other side, rhetoric and licentiousness and unjust political life, or more particularly, the life of the tyrant. However, if we consider Socrates' conclusion more carefully, we see that he nowhere disagrees with what we decided were Callicles' main concerns and conclusions. In fact, Socrates only makes Callicles' position from the conventional point of view even more cynical and extreme, if that is possible. It is my aim here to explain the meaning of Socrates' main conclusions and of their location in the dialogue. As this is not intended to be a complete commentary on the Gorgias, it is not necessary to embark on a close analysis of every single argument Socrates uses, though each of these is revealing in a special way. I will, however, consider closely the first argument, because it is the representative of Socrates' broader aims in the dialogue, as well as of his of his methods. Pardon me. See, this is what happens when the communists attack me. They step on my tongue, so to speak, right? They have a dwarf, like Bab says. Sorry, Dr. Alamer. Excuse me. Love Jim Beam. There we go. Back in the fight. Okay. I will, however, consider closely the first argument, because it is representative of Socrates' broader aims in the dialogue as well as of his methods. In his first substantial argument with Callicles, Socrates reaches the conclusion that nature and convention agree with respect to justice, and that therefore nature and convention are not opposites. This would seem to be straightforward defense of conventional notions of justice against Callicles' immoderate praise of the individual's ambitious pursuit of liberty and tyranny in the name of nature. Socrates says, "It is not only by convention that doing wrong is more shameful than suffering it, and having one's equal share is just, but by nature also." But if we look at how Socrates reached this conclusion, then it cannot be said to be Socrates' real opinion. The conclusion is based on the premise that the stronger and purely physical force is better, 488c and 488d5, which is not a premise that Socrates or even Callicles accepts. Right? Okay, so pause. Just as I had said before, I emphasized the delineation between the tyrannical Greek view and that of the much, let's say, peasant view of might makes right. Whenever you come into a rhetorical argument with someone that says, oh, you just believe in might makes right, what they're implying is an ogre-like, simple physical force, Stalin-esque type reaction, and that he who is mightiest is best in the purely military or conventionally kinetic sense. This is not the claim that's being made by either men, as obviously Dr. Allen implies. What they're saying is that the best men should win. And it's not technocratic, right? They're not saying that the best, bureaucrat, bugman should win. No, they're saying that the best individual, the man who is kalos kagathos, who is beautiful, who is a confluence of different excellences bound up into one individual, a super individual, that is he who should rule, not anyone else. Okay? I hope I'm making this clear. If you have any comments or concerns, questions, please leave it in the transmission notes, because it will help me understand where you're coming from and emphasize things if you want to have some more erudition, so to speak. Erudition, you see. I return to the text now. Now, why would Socrates be making an argument in which he does not believe? One could answer, in the traditional vein, that Socrates is using Callicles' own premises to trip him up. This would force Callicles to make his definitions more precise, and in the process Callicles would transcend his original position. But the following considerations show that while there is some truth to this way of thinking, it is in the end unlikely. Just comment. So what he's saying is basically the reason why Socrates was embarking, or the conventional understanding of why Socrates was making the extreme case, reductio ad absurdum. As much as I love the Romans, I'm terrible at Latin, so please bear with me here. The idea is that basically he's taking his philosophical abstract concept and taking it to an extreme example, so that way Callicles is forced then to be like, well, of course that's ridiculous, and therefore revise his answer. This is a common rhetorical trick, and it's something I myself use all the time. If you listen to my transmissions often, the reason why I take things to their absurd conclusion is because, not because they are absurd in of themselves, in the sense that the example that I'm proffering to counteract the whatever communist BS is going on, it's to show that the argument being made by Pinkos or whoever I'm trying to argue with is absurd because it's not universally true. Something that's not universally true, therefore, is obviously irrelevant and on its own merits is disregarded, right? And of course, the individual who articulates these positions, right, the communist positions, it is not to say that they will change their mind. The point of a debate has nothing to do with the debaters themselves, but rather the audience, and whether they're won over to one side or the other. So, reductio ad absurdum. Returning to the text. In his first speech, Callicles spoke often of the better or superior men by using the word beltion. The beltion is a generic term for superiority and goodness, but Callicles also used the word kreton, also almost interchangeably. And kreton is also a word for better, but with clear connotations of strength, bravery, and might. And this is my own note. And the Machiavellian virtu, right? And so this is what going back, Callicles is saying, and this is where he is being confused or conflated with might makes right in a petty, lowbrow sense, right? The ogre, right? As opposed to Socrates is critiquing him on the basis that he's using a term that implies brute physical force as a claim to legitimacy and superiority. Whereas, obviously, this is not the case for Callicles, is being misrepresented, but that's why there's such an important distinction. And words matter, right? This is something that I keep on telling people. It's very interesting. The English language is so rich. In fact, I would hazard to say it's approaching the richness of ancient Greek. Obviously, I'll get a lot of heat for that, but the reason why I'm implying this is because words mean things, and precise words mean precise things in precise ways, and the way that the word is embedded in people's minds matter, right? And so you have to bear this in mind, because rhetoricians, especially those that are, let's say, incisive and good with words, ultimately they will take you and take a position that you're meaning in good faith and interpret it in bad faith. And therefore, this is why command of language is so important. This is why command of pathos is so important. And this is why the command of logic itself is so important. So logos, pathos, ethos, right? Returning now. In his argument, Socrates introduces another word, iskrutoion, which is a word for superiority in brute force or strength, but without even the moral connotations of kreton. Callicles did not use this word in his first speech. As soon as Callicles agrees that all of these terms are interchangeable, Socrates is easily able to point out that many together are clearly stronger. Iskruteroi. Sorry, like I said, I am not a Greek individual. I do not speak Greek. It's all Greek to me, you know what I mean? Anyway, going back. Then the one, and therefore supposedly, by Callicles' own standards, they are also better, and therefore their ordinances are nobler, and so on. Callicles, however, had used the terms interchangeably in his speech and had agreed to Socrates' inclusion of the term iskeroterion. Jesus, I can't even pronounce it. I'm not even going to try in the future. In the definition of the superior, for a clear reason that has little to do with the way in which Socrates misuses it. In the state of nature, to which both he and Glaucon in the Republic refer, the one is stronger than the many who are not yet united. They unite and form conventions precisely because they are weaker, less manly, than the fewer strong, and because they wish to curb the advantage of these. Socrates is referring to strength, purely physical force in numbers, that is, after convention has already been established. In other words, he is, as Callicles charged earlier, again using words with natural meanings in a conventional sense, and vice versa, when it suits his argument. Callicles is exasperated by this ruse. He points out that the equality between the terms must be to move in both directions and not only in one direction. Socrates attempted to obscure the issue when he emphasizes merely direction of physical force. So, right, Socrates is interpreting him in bad faith, just as I had said before. Socrates replaced kreton, a word with moral and more plainly speaking behavioral connotations, with iskruteron, a word with no moral connotations or connotations of quality, and a word that was for a very good reason absent from Callicles' first speech. Callicles seems exasperated already at Socrates' unwillingness to understand what he means when he uses several different words for superior. The idea that the many, when put together, have an advantage in brute physical strength is a political non-argument, because the many are a political nullity in this sense. They do not lend themselves. A jacquerie, again, is never a revolution, and it is historically easily put down. Callicles believes that the practice of rhetoric is what gives the power of rule to an elite in a democracy. He is simply more cynical about the ambitions of those who claim to speak for the people. So, pause. All right. So, Dr. Alamur is saying three different things. The first thing, and I think is the most pertinent, is the concept of jacquerie. In American political context, there is always this insistence that the demos, the people, we the people and so on, if are faced with a tyrannical government, that somehow we will, en avant citoyens, gather the muskets, shoot the tyrants, all this stuff. But as you have seen in modern political dynamics, this is not the case, right? and the reason why is because there is no united belief. There is no cohesion in that kind of populist spectrum. And so that's the difference between a Jacquerie and a revolution. A revolution is a philosophy that's found its muskets, so to speak, right? In the same way that, or found its bayonets, in the way that Napoleon would talk about. Whereas a simple Jacquerie is simply, chimping out. It's being angry about one thing or another. It's basically L.A. riots or something. It has no greater political aim aside from loot and rapine and causing a headache for one specific issue. Does that make sense? So ultimately, this is the divergence between the two. And ultimately, Jacqueries never, ever actually take political power. They are limited in scope, both in ideation, in time and place and situation. So the second thing that Dr. Almer is talking about is, of course, this rhetorical device that Socrates uses, which is reductio ad absurdum, misinterpreting willfully the terms used by Callicles, so that way he can discredit Callicles, right? And the greater point behind this is, as Dr. Almer is pointing out, it has nothing to do with the fact that the points that Callicles brings up is true or not. It's rather he's misconstruing it on purpose with the aim of simply rhetorically defeating him, right? And then the third thing, which is implied from this deduction, right, if we can think inductively beyond this, is his purpose. Why is it that he's trying to rhetorically debate and discredit Callicles? Well, for as much as Callicles is being derided as someone who says or has studied under someone who believes that pure art of rhetoric and oratory is power in and of itself, what Socrates is doing, tongue-in-cheek, by example, is showing how easily words are nullified, and therefore words and force must be united, so that way there can actually be a confluence of these political elements into a political force later germinated. Okay? So what is this to say? Socrates is making a point. The point is that the unity of force and rhetoric must be united to actually have political potency. And ultimately, Callicles, who is ham-fisted with his arguments, has shown that words alone are not enough, not only simply because of the impetuosity of that young man who is recklessly saying things that are easily disproven, discounted, rhetorically overcome, but also that he's a nullity politically because of the fact that he doesn't actually have the force to bring to bear those two things. And so Socrates is showing the robustness and the limitations, the capabilities and limitations of both these elements, and how both must be united and intertwined, so that way political reality, political philosophy, the tyrant, could actually come to be. Returning to the text. Further still, Callicles' failure in the first argument would not have been completed had he not agreed to a certain other key dubious claim. For example, the notion that the ordinances, nomima, of the better are noble by nature is to be found nowhere in Callicles' original speech, either explicitly or as a consequence of anything that he says. As such, the argument is specious and a non sequitur, and it is essentially the same argument that Thrasymachus falls for in the first book of the Republic, when he seemed oddly unwilling to say that the superior or stronger can make mistakes in laws they frame. But Callicles acceding to Socrates' casual claim is especially strange in light of the fact that the whole notion of truth or nobility through speech or decree is entirely absent from Callicles' first speech. In this speech, truth is manifest only in action and practice. However, Callicles does not challenge Socrates' reference to ordinances or nomima, but by his silence at this point, and by an explicit reference soon after, 489c7, right, shows a certain respect for this word. In any case, these elements in Socrates' first argument against Callicles are revealed for the following reasons. Socrates does not trip up Callicles by playing on Callicles' own opinions or premises, but by subtly moving the conversation in a new direction, by introducing new notions, the notion of ischus, or pure force, as I have already pointed out, absent from Callicles' first speech. Socrates achieves his ends not by referring clearly and honestly to Callicles' own conclusions, but instead by emphasizing one half of an equivalence while obscuring the other, proceeding question by question and step by step in an entirely new direction. Finally, Socrates achieves his end by making a claim that he is neither present in his opponent's speech nor the consequence of anything the opponent has said, that the ordinances of the superior are always and also superior, but that he knows will be, for certain reasons, attractive to this particular opponent. These reasons are not yet clear. Exasperated by Socrates' sophistic demands that Callicles identify the superior, Callicles declared at 491d, "But I have really told you already that they are the prudent in the manners of the city and the manly." And obviously the terms are phronimoi and andreioi. These should rule the cities, and right is this, that they should have more than the rest, the rulers than the ruled. The superior are decided to be the prudent with regard to political matters, and the manly. The latter is a quality Callicles especially emphasizes by adding that these men will not falter through effeminacy of soul, dia malachian tes puscus. We have already seen that manliness is an absolutely indispensable quality in Callicles' first speech. But Socrates has played a small trick in forcing this definition out of Callicles. He has covertly moved the conversation away from Callicles' main focus, which is the lion cub enslaved by convention. The conversation has moved instead towards the lion cub, who is already becoming mature. The question for Callicles was the enslavement of the superior by conventional notions of justice, an enslavement facilitated by the corruption of manliness that philosophy effects in the souls of the superior. If man is already prudent in politics, phronimos, and manly, andreios, then he has, for the most part, already freed himself from the two dangers. He already does rule, and does follow his advantage, or is in the process of doing so, according to Callicles. Therefore, it is the superior who should become these two things, but are not necessarily so to start with. This is not, according to Callicles' original position, their ability to begin with, and it is not therefore an appropriate definition. In moving the discussion toward the end product and away from the critical issue of the erommenesteros, I can't even pronounce these words, the raw material for the superior by nature, who has not yet undergone any training, Socrates is moving the discussion away from the raw element of superiority that Callicles hopes will become a tyrant, but claims might regrettably also become a philosopher, and that Socrates elsewhere hopes might become a philosopher, but claims might regrettably also become a tyrant. Socrates moves the question away from the most fundamental issue on which philosophy and tyranny meet, even though this was Callicles' main concern in his speech. End quote. So obviously, we're going to read the rest of this section, but as you can see, the kind of cynical way in which Socrates is moving the main locus of the argument Callicles proffers for a purpose that will be revealed. This is the esoteric reading of Socrates, and to reiterate what has been said before, Socrates does not disagree with Callicles' personal opinion, and moreover, in this Platonic dialogue, is motivated by the idea, and most importantly the apologia, the emphasis on trying to let's say, buttress the PR of philosophy, and so therefore is trying to make philosophers out of tyrants, but is shown to see, from the reader's perspective, that it's actually these two are one and the same thing, and therefore this is the purpose behind the rhetorical argument beyond simply one or the other, hence the emphasis of rhetoric from the point of Socrates in rhetorically debating and defeating Callicles. I return to the text. Whatever we may say about Socrates' ambiguous remarks on the nature of the superior, he mostly leaves Callicles' definition untouched for the rest of the dialogue or abrogates it for himself. It is very clear that his long attack on the having more component of Calliclean natural right must be taken with a grain of salt. In the famous anti-hedonistic portion of the Gorgias, Socrates on the surface praising temperance and attacking licentiousness. And these respective terms are sophrosone and Acalasia, excuse me. But we can take none of Socrates' answers or claims in this section at face value. No matter how often Socrates repeats his accusations of licentiousness, and no matter how often he praises temperance, he makes certain seemingly offhand but in fact absolutely key statements that, unless we should be unreasonable and ignore them, change the entire meaning of his discussion. Socrates starts the attack on having more by turning the question of rule over others to the question of ruling oneself. This is a surprising and unnecessary turn that Callicles does not at first understand. When Callicles expresses confusion and asks what he could mean by ruling oneself, Socrates answers that he means nothing very colorful, but just as the many say, to be temperate and in possession of power over oneself, to be the ruling pleasures and the desires in oneself. Ibid. This is the first remark to which we must pay attention to. The words, but just as according to the many, cannot be taken in the context of Gorgias merely as a casual statement. The entire argument Socrates makes against rhetoric in the Gorgias requires a depreciation of the opinion and judgment of the many in order to make any sense. Socrates tells Polus that he has nothing more to say to the many. In particular, Callicles, with whom he is presently arguing, enters the discussion by calling Socrates a demigorius, a speaker to the many, to the demos, and of speaking only demikagorica, things addressed to the many, things to which Callicles elsewhere refers as fooleries or stupidities. Now, pause. This is important, right? Callicles is pointing out that Socrates is simply giving an exoteric presentation of his philosophy and not getting at, with frankness, about the substance of his philosophy. This, in and of itself, implies that the text itself also has an exoteric reading, as well as an esoteric one. These are the little tidbits that are very interesting. And like I said again, I really highly recommend Leo Strauss, because Leo Strauss really parses these different variables, and I do so in a very basic way. I'm a mere soldier, a humble soldier. I do not have a mega big brain like these people. But you have to understand one thing, is that if you pick up subtly, in these subtle little contexts, don't simply read passively, but question, and take these things to their logical conclusions, you start to understand that the premise that there's an esoteric understanding of Plato is teasing itself. It is telling on itself. When you stop and think about it. For instance, the fact that Callicles calls out Socrates for merely making, let's say, exoteric arguments. So anyway, I'll return to the text, and we're almost done with the chapter. Therefore, at the very least, in addition of the statement referring to the many in Socrates' definition of self-rule, is a rhetorical provocation against Callicles, who does not indeed shortly proceed into his second speech, an impassioned speech, if not a tirade against temperance and in praise of licentiousness. But in being a provocation, it is also therefore a deeply rhetorical statement that cannot reveal Socrates' real opinion or real position. There is no reason that a philosopher who believes in self-rule and temperance as a matter of justice or simple truth should have to refer to the opinion of the many on the subject, especially if this someone is a Socrates who said the things he had said earlier about the multitude, and who is supposedly trying to convince a Callicles who believes that the things he does about the many. The statement is intended as a provocation at this particular point in the dialogue, made against an exasperated and annoyed Callicles, and it is intended to elicit from him the inordinate praise of licentiousness, and thereby of tyranny. He actually embarks upon, from 491c to 492e, Socrates is then able to use this extreme speech to stump Callicles in a particularly vulgar way. Receiving any answer from Callicles that the satisfaction of all of one's desires is indeed what leads to happy lives, Socrates uses an excited oath and twice praises Callicles for not being bashful or ashamed to admit such a thing. He asks Callicles if someone who scratches himself perpetually and thereby satisfies a desire will also be leading a happy life. The dramatic peak, which is also the comic peak of the dialogue, is approaching. The next few exchanges, in which Socrates, again, ironically praises Callicles' manliness and his lack of shame, are absolutely critical to understanding the Gorgias. And this is the quote. Callicles. What an odd person you are, Socrates, an unskilled demagogue. Socrates. Why, of course, Callicles, this is how I upset Polus and Gorgas and struck them with bashfulness and shame. But you, I know, will never be upset or abashed. You are such a manly fellow. Come, just answer that. Callicles. When I say that man also who scratches himself will thus spend a pleasant life. Socrates. And if a pleasant one, a happy one also? Callicles. Certainly. Socrates. Is it so, if he only wants to scratch his head? Or what more am I to ask you? See, Callicles, what your answer will be if you are asked everything in succession that links on to that statement, and the culmination of the case, as stated, the life of catamites, is not that awful, ugly, and wretched? Or will you dare to assert that these are happy, if they can freely indulge their wants? Callicles. Are you not ashamed, Socrates, to lead the discussion to such topics? And of course, okay, end quote. So this is just my personal analysis here. Like I said before, this is an example of reductio ad absurdum. Socrates is taking the point of Callicles to its ultimate logical conclusion, right? The inordinate and ultimate following of the passions in different people means different things. For the tyrant, in Callicles' esteemed opinion, it means to be the best. But when taken in a universal sense, those who are low proceed and pursue low things to their extreme. If they were to allow to be extreme, they would lead themselves to ruin, right? Like the catamite. And therefore, it cannot be the case that simply following one's passions by being an avaricious or licentious individual is itself the answer, right? And this is where Nietzsche, I suppose, if he, in his critique of the Socratic and Platonic revolution, this is where he says, absolutely not. Yes, Callicles is right. To follow one's instincts is to do the correct thing, because from Nietzsche's perspective, he is commenting on the great man, the Übermensch, the Superman, or at least those that bridge to him. He doesn't care about the botched and bungled. In fact, the majority of his critique and tirades, especially in the genealogy of morals, has everything to do with denigrating and destroying any claim they have to being part of this universality. And so this is where we get obviously the split. It's interesting because philosophers speak to each other over the course of centuries, if not millennia in this case. But it should be an emphasis of why it is that Socrates is making this point, and Dr. Alan Barum, of course, will expound on this. The shaming of Callicles, and I'm reading now. The shame of Callicles is predictable given his character and also his position on natural right. Only a bit earlier, in his latest definition of the superior, he had emphasized manliness, Andrea, and attacked effeminacy of soul, malakia des puscis. By the way, in Greek, apparently, to call someone a vagina, it's malaka, so that's pretty interesting. I didn't know that. My Greek friend says it to me, yes. Greek junta stratehos, okay? Anyway, long story short. It is on account of its deleterious effects on manliness that Callicles attacked philosophy in his first speech and temperance in his second. Manliness is in every way central to Callicles' understanding of liberation from convention or of the appearance of the right by nature. Socrates has shamed Callicles by bringing up the example of the most unmanly men, suggesting somehow that they too would satisfy Callicles' criteria for happiness or liberation. But to understand Socrates' rhetorical defeat of Callicles, we have to pay close attention to the theme of shame in the Gorgias, a theme Callicles made central to his initial speech, and a theme that resurfaces everywhere at critical points. Note that after Callicles' first speech, Socrates praised his frankness, parasseia, and the fact that he lacks shame, axouni. Socrates agrees with Callicles that Gorgias and Polus only lost the argument because they were shamed, and therefore tacitly accepts Callicles' notion that shame stands in the way of truth. This is uncontroversial enough for now, but as Socrates says, if you can bear me out in any point arising in our argument, that point can at once be taken as having been amply tested by both you and me, and there will be no more need of referring to it at a future test or further test. for no defect of wisdom or access of modesty could ever have been your motive in making this concession. Nor again could you make it to deceive me, for you are my friend, as you say yourself. Hence any agreement between you and me must really have attained the perfection of truth. Therefore, according to Socrates' own claim, we can only be sure that the conclusion he reaches will possess truth or will be in the need of no further testing if in fact Callicles will at no point be encumbered by speech or shame. But we have just seen this is not the case, but that at the critical point, the crucial point, Callicles is encumbered by shame. Callicles is ready to admit that the scratcher fulfills his criteria, but too ashamed to consider the example of the catamite. Therefore, we can be sure that whatever explicit conclusion Socrates reaches together with Callicles, either here or in the future, will in fact be in the need of further testing, or that it does not necessarily possess truth, or, which is the same thing, that Plato, in having Socrates defeat Callicles in this manner, exhibits to us the essentially rhetorical character of the entire discussion in the Gorgias. Socrates' victory over Callicles has little to do with the truth or falsehood of the matter being discussed. It is for show or display, a display of something other than dialectical truth. In fact, the entire Gorgias is for show. It is a sinister dialogue, marked by sinister and even buffoonish theatricality in which all the characters come masked. There is no one we know by the name of Callicles. After being compared first to an eternal bird defecator, and next to a passive homosexual, Callicles is shamed or annoyed and remains relatively silent for the rest of the dialogue. On several occasions, he wants to end the conversation. This allows Socrates to push through some points that in light especially of what we have just considered, should at least raise eyebrows. At the end of his attack on intemperance, Socrates makes seemingly the most extreme case in favor of conventional morality and of convention in general. This is all supposedly against Callicles' praise of natural tyranny and licentiousness. Socrates says that the soul's arrangement and orders are lawfulness and law, respectively nomimum and nomos, from whence men become law-abiding, nomimoi, and orderly. These are justice and temperance. This is the acme, as it were, of Socrates' praise of nomos. But nomos means not just convention, but also law or way. Callicles had earlier referred to the nomos of nature. And if we should read the statements that precede this seemingly inordinate praise of conventional justice and temperance, we see that Socrates is not in fact defending common morality, but likening the lawful soul to the healthy body or to the well-turned-out work of art. As examples of nomima, Socrates does not refer to any good men and good souls, not to speak of good laws, but only to the productions of consummate craftsmen and to natural objects. Therefore, even here, it cannot be said that Socrates is in truth defending what the many say are justice and temperance against Callicles' attacks on these conventional notions. But finally, the very limited or merely rhetorical ad hominem nature of Socrates' argument against having more, or in favor of temperance, becomes clear if we consider the following statement Socrates makes at the end of his presentation. And this is Socrates now. Isn't it the case that the filling of one's desires, such as if one is hungry, to eat as much as he wants, or if thirsty, to drink, when one is in health, the doctors do allow with respect to many things, but when one is worked out, so to speak, they never allow to fill oneself with what one desires? And regarding the soul, O best one, is it not the same way? So long as it should be in pains, being unthoughtful and intemperate and unjust and unholy, it is necessary to bar its way of desires, and not let it turn toward anything except that of which it might become better. And this is from 505 Gorgias. Now this analogy, though Socrates does not really follow it up, and although a bored Callicles does not address it, qualifies the entire preceding discussion. The fact that it is only expressed once does not matter. It is in fact an incoherent admission, even as it stands, since licentiousness was early understood as filling of one's desires at will. Yet here Socrates is saying both that the filling of one's desires at will is allowed when one is healthy, and also that the same thing, licentiousness, is a symptom of a sick soul and pains. Now clearly we must resolve this tension in the following way, and realize that licentiousness itself is not an evil, but absolutely a positive good when the soul is healthy, and that it is only an evil when the soul is sick. For philosophy itself appears in the Gorgias, but also elsewhere in the Platonic corpus. The Symposium is only the most explicit and best known example, as a matter of freely entertaining the most intense eros, the most intense desire imaginable. The philosopher's temperance and justice are mere side effects, and if they exist at all, are for show. They only appear to the public as primary causes, or as attachment to morality, that is, to law and convention. The philosopher arrives at this condition, however, not by constraining or restraining anything, but by filling the desires of a healthy soul. The merely moral man, the man restrained by temperance and justice as a matter of habit and convention, lives under a tyrant and wishes to be a tyrant, as we learn from Socrates himself at the very end of the Republic. There could, in truth, be no greater agreement between Socrates and Callicles on the tyrannical enslaving character of conventional justice and restraint, as opposed to the liberating character of eros, and even of licentiousness in healthy souls. Callicles, who is not a sick soul, and does not have an inordinate desire to become a perpetual scratcher, defecator, or catamite, is bored and annoyed by what must seem to him, like Socrates, disingenuous and pious moralizing. He all but drops out of the argument, which forces Socrates to embark on perhaps the most lunatic and most exasperating portion of the dialogue, a question and answer session with himself. Amazing, isn't it? It is difficult to see how any reader can take Socrates seriously at this point, and not see this as a Platonic parody of the Socratic method. But Socrates then suddenly switches focus, and for the rest of the Gorgias attempts a different argument, one that plays more closely to Callicles' character and to the concerns he revealed in his 2 long speeches. Callicles comes alive again, and when Socrates changes topic and asks, "Now, what can be the art of providing so that we suffer no wrong, or as little as possible? See if it seems to you as it does to me. For to me it seems like this: either one must rule in the city or be a tyrant, or else be a companion of the existing regime, Politeia." This immediately appeals to Callicles for 2 clear reasons. First of all, in his first speech, but also later, Callicles had repeatedly advised Socrates on what measures he must take to protect himself from suffering wrong. The sense of Socrates' impending destruction at the hands of inferior men, a concern in which Callicles is proven right, as we know. Obviously, remember that Socrates was executed by the state of Athens for corrupting the youth, okay? So, again, reappears through the dialogue. Second, Socrates uses here the same words Callicles used during the second speech, which he said that temperance would be a vice for whoever already has or can procure an arche, or a turenia, in the city. Socrates' sudden concession that the political life can provide power, or at the least safety, excites Callicles. But characteristically, Socrates has introduced an entirely new concept and word into the Gorgias. This is the first instance of the notion of the regime, or the word Politeia. This is the means by which Socrates radicalizes the message of Callicles' first speech, in light of Socrates' subsequent discussion of the primacy of the regime. Callicles' opinions on the supremacy of convention or nomos seem limited and naive. Socrates replaces nomos with Politeia, the regime Politeia, as it were. The actualization of convention, it is nomos made concrete through physical force, which was absent from Callicles' story. Right? Like I had mentioned before, this is revolution. The distinction between Jacquerie and revolution is that of nomos, right? Which is ideology, which is substance, which is philosophy. And that ultimately a Jacquerie, much like a ham-handed or a ham-fisted tyrant, is merely, let's say like a abstract mirror of each other, but from different positions societally and politically. returning now, and last comment, this is why I also have a Politeia series, right? This is in reference to Socrates' distinction between Politeia and nomos. Anyway, returning here. The issue of the primacy of the regime is in truth closely related to the strange title of the Gorgias, an issue we would do well to look at before we consider Socrates' argument. We have already noted that Callicles and not Gorgias is the center of the dialogue in every way. Why is a man like Callicles at the center of a dialogue on political rhetoric titled the Gorgias? Is it because he exhibits the practice of political rhetoric in a revealing way? No doubt this is the case, but this is not a satisfying answer. Note, however, that for Callicles, the precondition of the just or noble life by nature is political power, in particular tyrannical power over the city. But Gorgias says that the virtue of rhetoric is to provide such power to men within their cities. Polus seconds this claim repeatedly throughout his argument with Socrates. Gorgias' student, Meno, echoes this claim in another dialogue. There should be no surprise, then, that a man like Callicles, who embodies and defends the tyrannical political life, should appear at the center of a dialogue on political rhetoric. But the point seems to be that Gorgias and Callicles' understanding of power or rule is politically limited and naive. I have already remarked on how Socrates introduces the question of physical force or force into his argument with Callicles, whose understanding of political control and political action was entirely in terms of speech. Pause. Remember what I said before? How I implied that basically the point of Socrates, his critique, his rhetorical device, was to, first of all, denigrate the position, right, to obviously divot into a new direction, but more importantly, to prove in act that his argument is false. That is to say, that the power of speech and argument is itself necessary but inadequate. Now I return anyway. The introduction of the issue of physical force into the argument already foreshadows the direction Socrates is to take. The absence of force from Callicles' first speech and the naivete Polus exhibits on his subject already indicates the politically limited understanding of the traditional orators. Socrates at one point hints at the great difference between the actual physical power of the tyrant and the power and speech of the orator. Did Callicles achieve his power through rhetoric? Can Gorgias teach a kind of rhetoric, perhaps a private rhetoric, that can sway men like Callicles? Is not the Gorgianic version of tyrannical power through public rhetoric limited to cities that actually have public assemblies, and assemblies of a certain kind, right? Because remember, of course, not all political city-states had the convention of debate, open debates in the forum, and even in those circumstances, the scope of that debate was limited by the attendees. In Athens, it was the most pervasive and most all-encompassing. The lowest class citizens could sit in on political debates that are being discussed in the public forum. Of course, they had limited rights as to interjections and so on. But Sparta, the most restrictive of this political city-states in these times, the Peloponnesian times, clearly is an example of the limited scope of public rhetoric, right? Because, again, Sparta is a military state, a state which takes its political principle from very few. It's an oligarchic state, for as much as they have a dyad monarchy. But anyway, long story short, going back. Callicles' interchangeable use of demos and nomos is key because it shows radically that his horizon and therefore his critique of convention is limited to the democratic regime. He is not able to consider or attack convention in all its respects because he has only been able to attack Athenian convention. And this is actually important. Remember, this is the issue with Callicles, and the reason why he's rhetorically inferior to Socrates is also because he's logically inferior. He's not wide-seeing, he's not far-seeing and universal in his vision of these absolute forms. So he's not, when he says he attacks convention, he's doing so in a limited sense and not from a universal sense. And hence why Socrates' critique and commentary are so necessary, is because it comments and describes and obviously critiques the concept of nomos itself, regardless of the type of convention at hand. Anyway, returning. Or, which is the same, his understanding of convention is mediated by the experience of the Athenian regime. In a certain sense, he is correct theoretically. Socrates elsewhere says that it is impossible for the demos to philosophize. A philosopher must free himself from convention, and it is possible to maintain in theory an essential relationship between nomos and demos, as Callicles clearly does. Callicles may be right that the demos is the source of all convention, but only considering the genesis of convention out of the state of nature. But in practice, Callicles has chosen the political path of liberation, and in practice, the regime is the concrete actualization convention and enforcer of conventions. In particular, in actual practice, Callicles' following statement is politically limited to democracy, and this is his statement. The makers of the laws are the weaker sort of men, and the more numerous. So it is a view to themselves and their own interest that they make their laws and distribute their praises and blames, and to terrorize the stronger sort of folk. They tell them that having more is shameful and unjust. Back to the original text. Can such a thing be said about the conventions in Sparta or Egypt? It is possible to maintain that in some way such things can be said about any regime, that despite its form, mass rule, or oligarchic, or even one-man rule, that in the end it is still for the benefit of the multitude and set up for their own sake. And Callicles is not a Spartan sympathizer. The Politeia is that which is in fact the source of convention. The many, the people, are arguably the source of convention or conventions only in a democratic regime. Even here, it is likely that the flatterers of the people who originate the nomos. The lack of awareness of the power and primacy of the regime is characteristic of the orators, who imagine that they rule when in fact they must accommodate themselves to the beast and serve it. At least this is the Socratic argument in the Gorgias, that all of this is a consequence of the orator's misplaced trust in the power of a certain kind of rhetoric that is weak, limited, and even so applicable only to certain types of regimes. End quote. So, just to reiterate, these are common themes that I had been explicating before, right? The idea that speech is necessary but not enough, and its utility is limited both in space and circumstance and time. So, just as Alamariu had brought up, Sparta and Egypt, both famously, obviously restricted in the right of assembly, the right of debate, and so on. For instance, in Sparta, the gerousia, right, the rule of the elders, they alone were the ones, the ephors, right? And the ephors are not something that comes from the movie 300. They're not like old freaks or whatever. This is just a dramatization borne on by Hollywood. But from before, if you read Plutarch on Sparta, the ephors are elected for 1 year at a time as a kind of Supreme Court justice, let's say. And they're there to regulate and comment, and obviously, in a certain sense, defend the conventions of the Politeia, of the Spartan Politeia, to ensure that with some rigidity, it's almost like a constitutional defense, to make sure that the culture, laws, and actions of the Politeia, Spartan Politeia, do not veer too far off course from the intentions of Lycurgus, he who was the lawgiver, he who was limited and gave the mission of Sparta its name, its purpose, and how it ultimately became a politeia in physical act, right? A convention born into reality. Or Egypt, for instance. Of course, Egypt is varied along its different epochs and different millennia, but generally speaking, the pharaoh was all-powerful, one-man rule, and of course he was circumscribed in his rule by the conventions of the priestly class, a highly, of course, priestly society, which in many different epochs, I'm not an Egyptian historian by any sense of the word, but from what I understand, the reason why Akhenaten was taken down was because of the dissatisfaction and perceived affront of the priests of their previous pantheon of gods. And of course, Akhenaten had created a monotheistic religion centered around the god of Ra, the sun, and was seen as kind of like a heretical nomos intruding type individual. And so, of course, in those circumstances, it's very difficult to actually have or see that political rhetoric in those circumstances would have the same sway as, say, in this case, the highly democratic regime of Athens, where, in Athenian democracy, according to their convention, it was the citizen body themselves, who were allowed to sit in and discuss and give their opinion to the different political matters at hand. And secondarily, this is of course commentary on the limits of what manipulation by rhetoric can do, right? Because ultimately, if you can be agnostic about the term manipulative, right? I'm not talking about it in a negative sense like you think, but if you can change someone's opinions towards assenting to a certain action or proposed course, that is what is I consider manipulation that is shorn of the moral prejudice of, whatever it may be. But the greater point that I'm trying to make here is that they have limited scope. If you've been in the military, of course, you can do much with inspired, impassioned speeches, but they are all circumscribed in content and in action by the rules and regulations, conventions, and traditions of any given service, country, and so on. For instance, in the United States, of course, we have a limitation of the rhetoric and the ability of people to do so. Anyway, legionaries, we return to the text. Whatever way one may decide on these questions, it is the case that, as Plato presents them, in being a student of Gorgias, Callicles has an inordinate respect for the power of speech. It is on account of this fact that his understanding of enslavement by convention lacks any mention of force. Socrates' introduction of force into the discussion of political control points to the crucial difference between Socratic and Gorgianic politics. A basic impression of this difference is available through the consideration of another Socrates-Gorgias pair, this time in Xenophon's Anabasis. There, one may compare Xenophon, the student of Socrates, with Proxenos, the student of Gorgias. The chief difference has to do with the political acumen. Proxenos is limited to the influence only among gentlemen, but Xenophon possesses the ability to communicate easily among all classes of men with all regimes. The difference between the two, the fact that Xenophon is tougher and wilier than Proxenos, reflects the fact that Socrates is tougher and wilier than Gorgias. Socrates introduces the element of force in the discussion of convention, and thereby the concept of the actual political regime, Politeia, the reality through which nomos becomes actual and concrete. The Politeia is at once the work of the lawgiver, the nomothetes, literally the establisher of convention, and the source and sustainer of all particular nomoi. The Politeia brings the consideration of assimilation and enslavement of the superior into a more immediate and concrete sphere of action than it was available in Callicles' politically limited horizon. Right? So just as I had said before, Socrates is making a universal critique, a universal explication of the same substance, but following in the same spirit as Callicles. This is the teaching, right? This is the real understanding of Plato, is that Plato is first of all making two philosophical contributions. One, which is universal in character, right? It's not limited in its very limited scope of Athens at this very specific time in its political history, right? So it's universal and it can be used for all time. It's why philosophy is the crown of civilization. It is the necessary, unfortunately, because of modern times and the way that we rear our elites, we believe it to be this auxiliary kind of, let's say, pursuit. But this is why Plato is so important, because ultimately he gives a universal commentary, one which is universal in time and place, and then second of all, he gives attenuated or nuanced discussion and presents the spirit of Callicles, but with the more enlightened, erudite, and more circumspect abilities of Socrates. Okay? Anyway, going back. According to Socrates, Callicles pursues political life but does not realize it is the political regime, the polis and its rulers, who enslave through convention. Socrates points out that a man who will want to be in such a kind of power as required for Callicles' version of the just or best life will have to assimilate himself or homogenize himself with respect to the ruler, to the regime. He plays on Callicles' fears of enslavement and desires for liberation, on account of which Callicles had chosen the political life in the first place, to make him avoid political life as the orators practice it. Callicles had it all wrong in his model of liberation. Conformity and literally homogeneity, not revolt, is the means to power. particularly when one seeks power through public speaking in a democratic regime. Callicles will have to praise and blame the same things as the regime does. Exactly the same words Callicles uses twice in regard to how the convention established itself and enslaves the souls of the superior. He will have to accustom himself out of his youth to the ruler of the valuations of the regime, just as in Callicles' account the superior are taken from their youth like lions informed in accord with the valuations of the nomos. With no knowledge of what is actually noble, the man who seeks the rule that is a necessary prerequisite to Callicles' best life or to what is just by nature will have to conform to the conventional notions of the noble. And if these are not in fact noble by nature, then the superior man will corrupt himself in the process. Worse still, the demos, the regime on which orators depend and which, as we have seen, is for Callicles intimately related to the idea of nomos, will ultimately destroy the superior men it uses or cater to it. The means by which the superior men are corrupted and even killed by the regime are, in Socrates' words, therefore remarkably similar to the means by which, in Callicles' speech, they were corrupted by the nomos. Socrates does not therefore challenge, but even radicalizes Callicles' hostility to nomos in the second argument. Both Callicles' tyrannical and Socrates' philosophical life are based, from their respective points of view, on a similar attitude towards the existing regimes or existing human conventions. Socrates presents this more convincing argument and concession to his kinship with Callicles after a lot of boilerplate mythologizing about the justice of popular or conventional notions, as if maybe to say, "No, not I. I'm certainly not for tyranny or intemperance or any of these bad, nasty things you're expected by pupil Critias for." The discussion in Book 6 of the Republic, 491a ff, only supports this claim. In fact, the use of the word eromenesteros in the passage is parallel to Callicles' use of the word in his first speech in the Gorgias. In both cases, a rare and superior natural specimen is corrupted by a human convention or by the conventions of the regime. The corruption takes place in the soul, whether by means of imitation of the regime and its conventions, or as a result of bewitchment by these conventions. In both cases, the corruption enslaves the superior and finally obscures from them their proper liberation and hence the just by nature. It is difficult to see, then, by what reasoning Socrates is said to have refuted Callicles in this dialogue. The two seem to agree on the fact that the eromenesteros and his salvation and preservation is what matters, that without this there is neither philosophy, nor tyranny, nor the original and raw wild biological matter from which each uniquely grows. And the character of Socrates' refutation even seems to confirm that Callicles' choice of tyranny was itself motivated by the same desire for the preservation of nature, that is, of breeding. The only serious refutation in their exchange has to do with Socrates' criticism of Callicles' political naivete. Overt tyranny in the name of nature and breeding, like Socrates' student Critias attempted, is not possible and causes an even greater conventional or democratic counter-reaction, which is exactly what happened with Critias and his friends tried to set up a regime. Callicles is too caught up in conventional assumptions and a conventional frame to properly challenge or to manipulate convention. He does not have the necessary remove from convention to really understand how to seduce it and subdue it to the long term. He doesn't understand the new rhetoric that Plato teaches. That is, I would claim that not only do Socrates and Callicles agree fundamentally on the problem, in quotations, the salvation of the eromenesteros and therefore of physis from convention, but even on the ultimate solution, which is to rule in the city. It is only that Plato is much wilier about how to achieve this, and that in fully understanding the requirements of rule and therefore legislation in the highest degree, he realizes Callicles' aristocratic radicalism must be spiritualized, and similarly, the form of rhetorical warfare for which Callicles is eager must be spiritualized or intellectualized. End quote. So that's the end of the section, and I think this is the last part. The conclusion is probably the most important. If you hadn't heard anything but this is probably the crux, the crescendo of the entire thesis of that section, which is the following. 1. That Socrates fundamentally agrees with Callicles in a spiritual sense, right? They share the same aim. Callicles, who is young, naive, reckless, a poor rhetor, even though he places much emphasis in the rhetorical device of power, because he's limited to the Athenian assembly in scope, and therefore in that Politeia, even though his heart is in the right place, it's like in the Marine Corps, they say, good initiative, bad judgment. They both agree on the idea that the best men should rule, that the tyrannical and philosophical men, those men of great breeding, of great aristocratic breeding, the best, should rule. Okay? But Socrates' critique, this is point 2, is that ultimately the character of Callicles is insufficient. He's insufficient in that he's still a slave, like his operating system, like a computer, is still running the operating system of Athens. It is not taking itself into a third-person perspective and perceiving the Athenian convention, the nomos, the Politeia, from almost like an alien's perspective, right? The god's perspective. And this is the excellence of Socrates, because he provides, or rather, obviously through Socrates is just a device for Plato. This is the excellence of Plato, right? Because ultimately he perceives regimes, Politeia, on their merits, from the merits of a universal perspective, from one which is unencumbered by the conventional notions of a regime. What does this mean in modern terms? So, for instance, in the United States, one may have a certain idea of what must change, but one cannot do that, right? And think that temporary tactical changes are in and of themselves coterminous with the ultimate strategic goals of change itself, right? So this is why, for instance, the Founding Fathers, who were greatly, let's say, inspired by the classics, by, of course, Anglo-Saxon traditions that are conventionally within the norms, had to rely so much on philosophical thinking to establish and become lawgivers in the kind of ancient Greek sense, like Solon or Lycurgus. They had to see the political conventions of their time as something that was limited in time and cultural space. Now, if you look into Thomas Jefferson and the Freemasons, they themselves, especially those that are brightest amongst them, had this third-person tertiary perspective. However, just as the Founding Fathers were not perfect men, and of course, because they were so limited in their experience with anything other than the conventions of their time, which is, of course, these are learned men. I'm not denigrating their acumen or their intellectual vigor. In fact, many of them were polyglots. They were literate in Greek and Latin, and spoke many other languages and were well traveled. I mean, John Adams went to the Netherlands and later France, and Benjamin Franklin, of course, was a huge Francophile. But the greater point that I'm trying to make is that Western civilization itself has a nomos embedded within itself, and the divergence within the West is tripartite, right? There's obviously the Eastern European tradition, one which is encapsulated by the experience of, Prussia, Russia, and later, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire at that time. The Latin experience under Spain, Portugal, Italy, and so on. And then finally, of course, the Anglo-Saxon Western Germanic experience, which is heavily focused on the convention of an early armed democratic assembly, one which had an emphasis on the Hamlet, the lower perspectives, a Whiggian perspective, right? And this is not to say that these are true in all times, nor are these archetypes perfect examples. They're heuristics, rules of thumb. Of course, like for instance, Austro-Hungary was a great example as an empire. Of course, there was one-man rule, but the rule of the emperor was not omnipotent in the same way as the Tsar was. And the Tsar was circumscribed by certain conventions of state, which prevented him from acting in a clearly, or in a colloquially arbitrary way. Okay? So obviously the Orthodox Church in that state and country and civilization. But if we were able to zoom out, and if we were able to recenter our conversation here with Callicles and Socrates, what he is saying is essentially the same parallel between himself and the founding fathers, that to truly understand the nomos, the Politeia of Athens, to truly change it, one must perceive it from outside. And to do so, first one must lead a philosophical life, which in and of itself is a freeing from the nomos. And this is not like the same thing as being beyond the jurisdiction of any one given polity. This is to be internally, to be free of the conventions of the time, right? So, this is the challenge that it's hard to explicate, and this is the reason why Socrates makes a special emphasis, much to Callicles' consternation, is that ultimately Socrates is saying one must rule oneself first to rule others. And what he means by this is to be ruled by one's own laws, one that is not a slave to convention as such, and therefore regulated on his own merits as a tyrant of will within first. Then, and only then, right, when you're able to conquer yourself, when you're able to immunize yourself from the greater conventions of their place and time, then are you able to actually conceive of an abstract principle and impose that upon others, because you're able to be like Lycurgus and impose a new set of conventions and nomos and ways of being which are reflective of yourself. Now the limitations are widely known, right? Of course, to a certain extent, it's like that same thing, right? With everything in life, you must be firm on principle and flexible on approach. Those who are firm in approach, who wish to act idealistically, are unable to actually effectuate change. Why? Because ultimately, you're not engaging with the psychological, socio-psychological terrain of any given political place. And so this is the critique Socrates is giving of Callicles. He is saying that he's still very much an Athenian, even in the devices that he attempts to use and say that is omnipotent, right? The power of speech. Callicles, at least. Even though it is the case that Callicles wishes to use speech, it is indicative of the fact that he is still Athenian at base, and therefore, any action of his to engage in such a way will ultimately merit a very much democratic counter-revolution. An example from the Athenian regime is, of course, that of Pisistratus. Pisistratus was the tyrant of Athens. He's the one, as I've said in the previous episode and transmission, is that he's the one who was actually the centralizing figure for all Greek culture, and the reason why Athens became such a prolific cultural, let's say, creator, right? He's the one who was first a man of great power and then a man of great taste, and bound up in and of himself through his own personal, let's say, patronage, the various cultural, artistic, philosophical figures of his time, of the entire Greek oikonomene, and concentrate them as in a hothouse almost to proliferate their cultural contributions within Athens proper. Following Pisistratus, I believe it's his third son, the aristocrats of that time, the lower nobility, mounted a counter-coup against Pisistratus and his dynasty, and ultimately leveraged the people in an democratic counter-revolution, one which saw an ever-increasing democratic response to the original thesis of Pisistratus, who was, in and of himself, by his actions and his, I guess, philosophical actions borne out in time, completely at odds with the ethos of the Athenian nomos, of course. And the reason why he was able to have such ascendancy was because he was, as Socrates points out, effective in using both force and speech. And ultimately, he was someone who was above convention, and the fact that he was able to, I mean, this is indicated by the fact that he was able to reach across the Greek oikonomene, and for many of us moderns, we consider the Greeks as a monolithic culture, but the truth is, they diverge very much, right? So within Greece, there were multiple different ethnic tribes, right? The Dorians, the Ionians, the Aeolians, and so on. To say nothing, of course, of the abutting Galicians, the Celts, the Persians, the northern Baltic tribes, Balkan tribes, the Italic civilizations of the now starting to bloom kind of Romantic Latin civilizations around Etruria and so on. And so the fact that he was able to reach out and be so truly cosmopolitan shows that he was above convention, shows that he was able to master the nomos of his given city-state because of the fact that he was truly universal as a man, right? He was a universe unto himself. This is an epitaph that's generally given to Heraclitus, but this is true of Pisistratus. Now, if we were to look in history, and we look at Lysander, for instance, and the Peloponnesian War, right? So it's the Delian League, and the war between Athens and their city-states, and of course Sparta and its city-states, in a ever-changing fresco coalition of warring city-states against each other. This cataclysm, in and of itself, did two things. First of all, it acquainted each Greek city-state with the conventions of each other, so there was a lot of cross-pollination. For instance, even in the military technology of the time, and Victor Davis Hansen has extensive scholarship on this topic, but specifically even in the modes of warfare, they became homogenized as in their experience in the cross-pollination. Well, that's a very simple and kind way of saying the violent encounter with the technologies and modes of being of every other city-state gave rise to a natural equilibrium in which technology was given a new crescendo, a new force, that proved one mode of military mobilization, training, and patterns to the fore, right? And so before the Peloponnesian War, there was the hoplites that would engage in battle in a very limited and very ritualistic way. I mean, even the Spartans, for instance, they would have a stone that would mark the territorial boundary between each city-state's regional domain. And so these abutting or fighting city-states' phalanxes would meet on the battlefield of that stone. Those who won the battlefield, right, who won the battle the conflict that they had, would have the right of the victor to do two things. To first of all move that stone, to extend the territory of their political or the Politeia, but also secondarily, in a ritualized form, to give over the dead of the enemy. And it's very interesting. The convention at that time was that after the battle had been won, obviously the rout would ensue. There'd be the majority of killing actually happens in routs, and this is true throughout history. So this is why aggression and stalwart defense are better than running away. Running away is literal death in the military science and art. But if you return to this after the rout is basically culminated and there is a semblance of a truce, the commander or the most senior commander to survive of the defeated army approaches the commander of the victorious army and asks for permission in a basically a supine way to collect their dead. And because of the fact that obviously they're moral in the sense that it was given that men who died and who were not given proper burial could not enter Hades in the afterlife, and therefore could not be buried upon the lands of their fathers. Hence why, by the way, the term patria, a Latin term for fatherland, is completely divergent from that comes in the 1900s, 1800s. Literally, patria in the time, the land of our fathers, the reason why they called it that is because they would literally bury their fathers and ancestors in the land itself, right? And so it was beyond simply an abstract romantic perception of what one is. It was a real, very real sense that, to lose your city is to lose the connection between yourself and your ancestors, and a great sacrilege happens in defeat. And therefore, of course, abuts the sense of community cohesion and sense of self, right? This is why in the democratic city of Athens, it wasn't a universal city in the sense that we mean today in liberal democracy, where everyone can be a cosmopolitan cosmopolitan elite who is an autonomous cipher, that has no connection to the past or the future, who just simply is and is a vector of economic activity. Back then, to gain admittance to the citizen rolls, literally a list of all the citizens who were a congruent part of a city, you had to actually be of blood and ancestry of a certain place. Okay, so returning to the original point, and the point being, of course, the nomos and the changing nomos of military efforts, two things happened. War became more fluid. It was waged on ever greater horizons, and the cause of things, and waged in such a way that was effectively against convention. And most importantly, if you remember, in the opening exchange between Athens and Sparta, the Athenians land on the island of Melos, and they completely outnumber Melos. And this is where the term from Thucydides comes: the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. And this was given as a riposte to the Melonian political committee that had been sent to the Athenians, right? And was effectively suing for terms. And that ultimately, the way in which the Athenians had responded was it was an affront to all the gods. And of course this had immediate diplomatic and political ramifications and eroded the Athenian Empire as such. There's a great series, by the way, by a great professor who is unfortunately now deceased, by Donald Kagan. He has a series of books regarding the Peloponnesian War if you want to know more in depth. However, the greater point that I'm trying to extrapolate from this is the fact that the Peloponnesian War was a wrecking, a destroying of convention by necessity in a way that had been unprecedented before. And so in the culmination of that war, Sparta wins. Sparta, as part of its truce imposed upon Athens, it does two things. First, it instructs the Athenians to tear down their long walls. If you ever go to Athens, the Athenian Acropolis is located some miles from the coast, right, the Aegean coast. And in that ancient time, there were these long walls, literally connecting the city itself, proper, to Athens, and the road to the harbor, right? And so this was seen as a major source of power for the nobility of Athens and its maritime power and strength, and therefore taking it down means that it would be constantly at the risk of being overrun, right? It could be easily checked. If it were the case that Athens was getting too uppity, the Spartans could send a crack force and burn it all down. And the second convention was the rule of the 30. Lysander, the commander of the Spartans, who originally was the basically admiralissimo of the Spartan forces during the Peloponnesian War, later became a great commander, had imposed this convention upon the Athenians, which was alien, right? It's the tyranny of the 30, which was an oligarchy, one of whom had the famous name of Callicles. Callicles and a number of these tyrants, although this is again a heuristic, a rule of thumb, it's not an absolute, so those of you who are Greek scholars, please don't check me up. I'm just trying to give you a working frame of knowledge to understand the paradigm was what's happening. But ultimately, Callicles was part of an aristocratic faction that was laconophilic, right? So they loved Sparta, and Sparta, being of course a highly oligarchic military state, they wanted to reflect it. And as we will see if you read Dr. Alamer's dissertation, which is this book, you will see that Sparta is actually the fossilized convention of aristocratic Politeia born through time, the one that had changed the least and that had given rise to the highest of men. In fact, I would even venture a little bit further and say that Socrates, Plato, and a number of other true believers in the Platonic Academy were actually laconophiles themselves, hence the threat of Socrates, right? And so what Callicles, as part of his program, was not simply to take power as an oligarch and rule in the fashion of Pisistratus, as I had elucidated before, but to completely change the nomos itself, right? And this is the mistake that he made, is that basically he started unironically, his eugenic program, in which he, at will, abridged and liquidated elements of the demos, the lowest classes. He destroyed the merchant elite, so the petit bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie, so that way he could centralize power back to a Homeric ethos where the aristoi win. The aristoi rule, not simply de facto, but de jure. And of course, this is a great affront. This is a great affront to the Athenian assembly, and is itself defeated by the Athenian demos. An interesting aside, though. When there's a counter-revolution, in this case Callicles, and when they executed all of them, the Spartans were reluctant to launch a counterattack. And the reason why, and it's very interesting, Lysander, who was gifted in speech, and it's funny because it's related to the topic at hand here, Callicles. Interesting. I wonder if it's the case that Callicles was actually an archetype of not Plato or Socrates or anyone else, but actually Lysander, for the following reason. So Lysander, of course, was a Spartan. He had been brought up in the Agoge. He had been someone who was a Spartan through and through. He wasn't changeable in nature in the same way that Alcibiades was, who famously, of course, went from city-state to city-state, adopting their customs with ease, and becoming the best among them regardless. No, he was actually a Spartan through and through. However, as a gifted rhetorician, he was able to change some of the forms of the essential Lycurgan state. Namely, of course, mounting a navy, principally, using Persian money, which had been seen as a great sacrilege to many of his political peers, but was given over by his rhetoric alone, persuaded by his rhetoric alone. The Gerousia, the ephors, and the kings were all won to his cause. However, in the successful culmination of that war, Lysander is accused of sacrilege, and ultimately, in his chest, they discover a speech that had been written, a speech which was so terrible, so persuasive, so changing to the Lycurgan state, that not only did they burn them, but they killed him promptly and immediately. They dispatched him. So the interesting thing to me, and I add this is nowhere in the book, the interesting thing to me is that maybe Callicles is Lysander. Or maybe it's the case that Lysander was a failed Socratic philosopher. But anyway, returning to the original text here. So we had those first two claims, right? The first one being, of course, the circumspect and universal nature of Plato's contribution to the political philosophy. The second, of course, being the nomoi and the engagement with the nomos and the way in which one must first liberate oneself spiritually, abstractly, to be able to change the outside. But also tertiarily, and this is the final point, is that to change a politeia, one must change it from within. Now, this is pertinent not simply in ancient Athens, right? And as we'd see later, of course, the exploits of Plato. He would go to the court of Dionysus of Syracuse, and he would give his ideas and conventions to Dionysus. Of course, he failed in expectations for Dionysus in this given term. However, the interesting thing is that later in Athenian history, there would be great convulsions, right? There'd be the introduction of universal military service, a term of conscription of 2 years, in which Athenians would be basically given an agoge-type rearing. So many of the different cultural conventions which had leveraged a merely citizen body, or a citizen soldier ethos, where it was fundamentally a militia, one which is voluntary, the Athenians adopted a Lycurgan institution of conscription, of military service, of training, of effectively the changing way in which war was made was itself a Lycurgan innovation. And like I said before, Victor Davis Hanson has a great treatise on this. I'm not going to explicate it any further, but for you legionaries to understand, these changes came about because they engaged with the nomos itself. They were the ones that were taking from the context of the nomos, right? They were flexible in approach, but they used the means that were at hand to approach the limits of that conical, conventional action, right? Political action towards Lycurgan ends. And now this is the major failure of Callicles, is that he was too brazen, too obvious, and he did not come in the confluence of the democratic ethos of the Athenian state. In fact, it was later his heirs that were the ones that were able to take Athens and make it Spartan. And this is the effort that Plato would later have, taken up by Aristotle. Aristotle, of course, reared Alexander and his peers, many of the noblemen, and it was they who established the Greek Empire, right? The Hellenistic Empire, the Hellenistic civilization, from which we understand the Greek excellence of today. In fact, I would even say that the Peloponnesian War was this great conflagration, this great breaking apart of convention to give rise to great men such as Alexander the Great. He himself, the ultimate justification of Greek civilization, just in the same way that the French Revolution was made manifest for the sole purpose of proffering a Napoleon. And later, of course, Napoleon III, who I'm a huge fan of, but you understand the point. Now, to bring full circle, the utility of philosophy. I hate saying that because I'm not a utilitarian, but the purpose of philosophy, how it was germinated. Well, philosophy is precisely this, is to, first of all, make abstract the values one holds within oneself, right? In this case, of course, it was the aristocratic ethos. To make it abstract, to radicalize it, and to make it something that one could impose intellectually upon the nomos and change convention. However, convention can only change from within. Ultimately, this is where Machiavelli talks about how if a free city is taken, it must be destroyed, for they will always have traditions of freedom, right? Because there's something about that political community, the Politeia, that retains its core essence, right? Essence and form are two different things. The essential nature of something is multifarious, right? However, any one particular crystallized form of an essence is different. So think, for instance, of a chair. A chair comes in very different styles. It comes in a metal style. It comes in a something very crudely hewn out from a tree trunk, or it could be something exquisitely made from a cherry tree, and so on and so forth. However, we still understand it as the essential nature of a chair. Much in the same way that Athens cannot be changed, right? It cannot be changed with the people that are there, because even though you may impose different forms upon it, and may actually obviously crystallize its own, generate its own crystallized forms which are correlated to its essential character, you cannot pose things that are alien to it, because it revolts, and it reverts back to the locus or the inertia, the centropode of its conventional state. Now, how is it that political change actually happens, right? Political change, and I proffered the following, is Rome. Roman republicanism giving way to the Roman Empire. There's a lot of synergy between the revolt, first of all, the imposition of tyranny through Pisistratus, the reclamation of democracy from Pisistratus and his dynasty, later the imposition from abroad of foreign imposed, let's say, Critian-led 30 tyrants, which was immediately democratically revolted against, and it reestablished both itself as a politeia and obviously its long walls, to which Sparta, by the way, didn't respond because, of course, of Lysander and the scandal there. And besides, the point of Sparta, which was a highly conservative state, did not seek to change the conventions of others, but rather to maintain the hegemony, right, the de facto realpolitik power balance between itself, which saw itself as the first amongst many city-states, the king of all city-states. And so, anyway, and by the way, after the Critian Revolution, or the imposition of the 30 tyrants, and their deposition, or deposing, excuse me, not their deposition, yes, their deposition. In fact, they were assassinated at Parley, but anyway, long story short, there were no more tyrants until the coming conquest of Alexander the Great. And by the way, he never changed the conventions of the Athenian city-state and let them govern by themselves. This is, of course, a major mistake that the United States has embarked on in the previous epoch, for the last 20 years of GWAT, where we had gone on this adventurous, let's say, foreign invasion, where we conquered a country, Iraq and Afghanistan, and tried to impose forms and conventions which were alien to the local and respectively Arab and Pashtun, largely, obviously, Islamic, nomos, right? We're introducing something so foreign, and Napoleon also ran into these same problems himself when he conquered Egypt and other territories of the Ottoman Empire. Now, to bring it full circle here, the greater point that I'm trying to make is that to change something from within is the only way one can change. And the nomos has a conic, a cone of action it can take without it reacting or it, reclaiming its hegemony, its essential nature. So, to go back to ancient Rome, the Roman Republic and the rule of the Optimates was something that was supreme and a given part of its constitutional nature. The nomos of the Republican Rome was one which was inherited by custom and tradition via its senatorial elite. The senators, of course, were those that had themselves been of the most ancient and illustrious families from the founding of Rome or even before then. For instance, of course, Julius Caesar claims descendants from the goddess Venus and from the time of the kings, right? I think Numa Pompilius is actually his ancestor. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But remember, when Julius Caesar comes to power, and he rules as a dictator, which, by the way, according to the convention of the Roman Republic, was part of the constitutional nature, right? For instance, there was Cincinnatus, and there was later, of course, Fabius, right? But they relinquished their command. Part of the convention of ancient Rome was dictatorial powers were only done in a state of exception. In the case of Fabius, right? Ultimately, the Fabian strategy required dictatorial power because it required great restraint, and to go against the impulsive nature of the Roman nobility required just one commander-in-chief with a unified understanding of his strategy. And so, but the thing is, after Hannibal had been beaten off, right? Yes, he was beaten off. No, he was beaten. Ultimately, he relinquished his command and did not arrogate himself to monarchical rule, which is, of course, the provision of dictatorship. But it was a temporary and limited nature in scope by time and circumstance, right? Of course, political necessity. What Julius Caesar did, which was a complete divergence from the earlier Civil War figures, was, first Sulla, then, of course, first Marius and then Sulla, was that they had imposed dictatorial powers, taken it up on themselves, either extrajudicially or through ostensible plebiscite, and then they made their changes, like Sulla, and then they left it, like a lawgiver. Now, why is it that Julius Caesar was assassinated? It was because he claimed dictatorial powers forever, for life. He was dictator for life. I mean, literally, he was acclaimed in the forum as such. And this is why the Roman nobility posed a counter-coup, right? A counter-revolution, an aristocratic counter-revolution to return to the essence of Republican Rome. And this essence, of course, saw the culmination of the assassination of Caesar, the overturning of the dictator as an institution, and later, when the rise of Augustus Caesar, earlier Octavian, comes to power, he too takes dictatorial powers, right? However, this is the key. This is how he actually changed the nomos of Rome into what we believe it to be today, an empire ruled by a monarch, which is what the nature of the monarchy is, right? It's basically one-man rule. And the office of the emperor is that basically he gave back the powers to the Senate being, of course, the locus of the power, the conventional power and legitimizing principle of the Roman Republic, and through a number of different, I would say, intrigues, political maneuvering, rhetorical persuasion, and so on, he was able to get the Senate to elicit these powers in multifarious different ways back into his person, right? And he never called himself a dictator. He never called himself, especially after the time he had basically put down the powers of dictatorial powers. He simply called himself the first citizen, the princeps, the first among equals. And later, this is where we get the word prince from, by the way, right? Leader. And if we understand prince in a classical sense, prince simply means basically the ruler of polity, right? He has basically the legitimacy of power. How he was able to get the nomos to change was working within it. He used the legitimate principle of the Roman Republic, the Senate, to give him the powers that were completely contrarian to the Roman Republican ethos, to rule as a monarch, but in name to retain a republican form, right? Because remember, even to the last days of 1453, where Constantine XII very bravely faced the Muslim hordes and launched himself into victory. And by the way, I believe Constantine XII, he is living under a mountain, and he will come back and conquer Constantinople when we are not simply willing, but meriting his presence, right? That's the legend, by the way. My Greek friend told me this. It's very interesting. No, but returning to the fact here, is that the following crescendo is how you change the nomos, is that you retain the outer forms of that nomos, right? So in the case of Athens, in the democratic Athens, it would retain its democratic flavor, its democratic assemblies, just like Alexander the Great allowed Athens to rule by its own. But clearly, it gave its sovereignty to Alexander the Great and was given a limited type of, let's say, autonomy, but as long as it was subordinate to the Alexandrian kingdom. Same thing with the Empire of Rome. This has led to a lot of wars, civil wars during the Principate, and of course civil wars dotted it throughout, and it's a function of the fact that it was fundamentally an innovation of the nomos, a convention which was very shaky and always shaky, and only solidified later by Constantine, that had imbued in it the hereditary principle. However, I don't want to get off track here. The point that I'm trying to make is the following, is that Augustus Caesar worked within the nomos, much in the way that Plato indicates. He does not abridge or change it in the way that Critias did and the 30 tyrants who wanted to impose a complete exogenous outward form onto an unwilling many. What he did was a work of art, really, a work of huge deception and a series of ruses in which they all acclaimed the emperor as the first amongst many, first citizen merely, and that he was still the upholder and protector of the republic, and that ultimately the legitimating principle of the Senate retained its powers ostensibly, and of course this is not the case. I mean, in reality and de facto, the Senate became a rump thing, especially after, I believe it was not Marcus Aurelius, it was Aurelian. Aurelian, who had moved the capital of Rome to Ravenna as opposed to Rome proper, and so it becomes this backwater, and it still derives its legitimacy from the Senate and people of Rome. However, it clearly de facto became completely shorn from this connection. So, this is what Plato is telling us. He's telling us that basically if you want to change the nomos of the given society you live in, first of all you have to be willing to completely divorce yourself independently, conventionally, morally, from the presuppositions of the people at our time. And you can do that through philosophy, and then once you have become a ruler of oneself, just as Socrates indicates to Callicles, you're able to rule the many through the various forms of the nomos as convention dictates, and manipulate it in such a way that the form itself crystallizes into something else, while still maintaining the essential nature of the polity you represent in the one that you take power of. Okay? So, in the case, let's say, a more, let's say, contemporary example for our time, because this is so remote, and this is a critique I keep on getting from people who talk about ancient history or critique the fact they think there's no salience between ancient times and now, as if somehow we're two different peoples because of the fact that technology and time has put this massive chasm between ourselves and them. But the truth is that humanity has relatively stayed the same. I would, in fact, genetically pretty dang similar. In fact, human evolution hasn't really occurred since the agrarian revolution of 10,000 BC. And therefore, one can make the claim that the political innovations, which is inherently a human institution, a human phenomenon, still has salience to today. And therefore, like, let's take the example of Napoleon III. Napoleon III of France. How did he take power? At first he tried a coup, and then he tried another one, and then a third one. And he failed, and while in prison, once he was freed, he ran for election. Interesting, right? The French Republic, which had become itself a democratic country, right, after the revolution, after the deposing of Louis XIV, or Louis XVI, I believe. Yes, it's Louis XVI. I had my Louis all messed up. They're all named Louis, you know, is what it is. Not to be confused with Louis C.K., the prolific masturbator. But any case, returning here, the thing is, he won through plebiscite, an absolute vote, obviously couched in the aura of Napoleon I, came to power, was a French president, then later legislated through a controlled assembly the powers of the empire, and then became the Second French Empire as Emperor of the French, as the House of Bonaparte. And so, as you can see, the changing of a nomos must happen within its institutions. In the United States, the reason why communism, leftism, is so ascendant for the last 200 years is because leftists are actually very good at political manipulation. They're very understanding of how humans work, psychologically speaking. And their opponents, let's say, ideal opponents in the political arena, up until recently, have been completely retarded, okay? Ultimately, they think that it's still 1776 will commence again and all this kind of stuff, but American society has not simply changed technically, technologically, and sociologically, and the reason why they fail is precisely because they don't realize the reality of their time. In a certain sense, for as much as they don't aspire to tyrannical rule, libertarians, right, classical liberals, they still make the same mistake that Callicles here made prior, which is, of course, to engage with the nomos that is non-existent, right? Because the nomos has fundamentally changed, especially since 1965. And therefore, the way that you change the convention of the time is through the twin powers of tyranny and philosophy. And this is the secret of Plato. This is the secret, of course, of changing and becoming ruler in a city. And to what end, right? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves. And to what end? Why is it that Plato was so motivated to change these things? Why is it that so many of these statesmen, these great statesmen, Napoleon III, Napoleon himself, the first, even Stalin, unfortunately, and so on, why is it the case that they want to change? Well, they want to approach the good, the ideal, and the good being, of course, natural good, that which gives rise to greater beings, greater forms, greater individuals. And this is the secret of great man rule. This is the essence of the political philosophy itself. I haven't decided whether or not I'll do a third section, which actually is probably meritorious on its own sake. Maybe I'll do it sometime in the distant future because I'm a little bit, I'm tired, you see, of reading these books. I gotta get beyond the wire. Sergeant Barnes obviously is nodded off because this is just beyond him. He doesn't care. That's okay. At the end of the day, the greater point that I'm trying to make here is the following, is that as part of the thesis of Dr. Alamuru, so geniusly pointed out, the purpose of Platonic philosophy is first of all giving the means by which the aristocracy, and not aristocracy in the sense that you think of it, like the blooded, frou-frou bunch of frills and bullshit just because they're rich or something. No, no, no. The aristocracy from natural right, the Homeric heroes, those who are naturally good. In fact, Thomas Jefferson was trying to impose this institution into the American psyche by couching his claim against the aristocrats of Great Britain in the sense that he wants to give rise to an aristocracy of merit. And this is the excellence of America, is this inherently meritocratic, inherently aristocratic ethos that the best should rule. The best should reap the rewards, and the many, who are masses, rabble, who are largely lumpen proletariat parasites, they should be actively excised. And so this is the crux of what Dr. Alamourou is trying to say, is that the Platonic philosophy is an esoteric equipment that great men, aristocratic men, use. It's almost like a handbook, right? I love this book by Edward Luttwak, Coup d'etat. It was a very funny way. I got it as a gag gift when I was 14 from my friend who thought it was funny because I would talk about it all the time as a joke. But I took it deadly serious, you see, and very dangerous. No, I'm joking. But the greater point that I'm trying to make here is that ultimately Plato was equipping the ideological element of how it is to be done. How is it that the meritorious, those who are full of Machiavellian virtue, come to power? And we see this throughout history. Platonic intrigues of the Pazzi family in Florence, and later, of course, in act, even though not in word or deed, the Platonic essence of the Medici rule in Florence itself. And of course, later, Napoleon and the revolutions of the 1900s. Now, this is what his main purpose is, and the ways to do it is through the convention of your place and time, and to be completely divorced first from the conventions of the Politeia you inhabit, and in our case as Americans, is to first to engage in this project. You have to divorce yourself from the given norms of Anglo-Saxon liberal institutions, right? The idea of the rights of man, John Locke, the individuated nature of things, and be able to look at civilizations universally, to compare and contrast, to look at the institutions which give rise to the best and highest excellences, and then mimic them within your heart, imbibe them in your heart, and then act in the circumstances that you are in, right? Not by imposing from without, outside of the convention of the norm of any given place in America, but through the institutions of a given place, and through the cultural achievements and abutment of cultural producers, right? And this is where Antonio Gramsci comes in. To change the psychological horizon of a people, you have to effuse the hegemonic cultural justifications of any given oligarchical state. Pareto talks about the law of oligarchy, and that ultimately there is in Gramsci the idea that effectively what an oligarchy does, or an incumbent elite does, what they do is they justify their rule, they legitimate their rule through cultural production. They create a complex, right? In Gramscian terms, this is called a superstructure. And the way that you couch your rule is through infusing yourself into the minds of the many. The ancient Romans, the way they did it is by, first of all, shrouding themselves in accolades and familiar terms of power, right? So, for instance, Augustus Caesar was given proconsular power. He was given X, Y, or Z power. He was the Pontifex Maximus, things that had already been traditionally in place. And then later, through a series of propaganda, most famously through Virgil and a number of other different poets and epic writers and historians, they couched his rule and inculcated their legitimacy of monarchy in the minds of the Roman citizenry via propaganda, right? This is what's called propaganda, but it's really just cultural. It's artistic, aesthetic effusion of the vision that you have for yourself and for the many as a project. This is why Napoleon is so smart. is because he wasn't really getting into the weeds of any one given philosophical bent or another. In fact, he was a master synthesizer and picked and chose one cultural fiber from another and wove it into a tapestry called Bonapartism, greatly taken up by, of course, the modern figure of Charles de Gaulle, who is also passed, but has maintained this Bonapartist ethos within the French Republic. Now, this is the secret, and this is why in America the left is so ascendant, is because they impose the superstructure, and they also, they couch their rule in the cultural production of Hollywood and so on, and through the various organs of journalism and so on. And then later, of course, and also coterminously, they take political power in their ascendancy. But they never go outside the conventional norms, or at least none which are outside of the American experience. They may, of course, like during the days of rage during the 1970s, they may do a number of different terroristic bombings, executions, assassinations. For instance, like the attempted assassination of Donald Trump like 5 times, Kirk and so on. But they never do things such as imposing a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship, out the gate. They don't do that. They basically boil the frog. And that's the theory of how to change a cultural horizon of a people and mold it into something else. This is why the Soviet Union, by the way, had retained many of its czarist organic structures, which, it's funny to say that Stalin, upon reaching ultimate power as the premier of the Soviet Union, had gone to visit his mother in Circassia. And, in old age, she said, how are you doing, my son? And he says, well, the Tsar of old, I'm kind of like that. And she's like, you'd have been better as a priest. Which is probably the most sound rebuke of any son to his mother. I gotta tell you, that's just chef's kiss. But then, of course, it's some interesting things, like, for instance, the Medici. The Medici were great creators of cultural power precisely because they were motivated by this political impetus, right? They wanted absolute power in the Florentine Republic, and therefore had to couch themselves in a cultural superstructure which would allow the Florentines to accept the rule. And this is where Machiavelli comes in, but also Bernini and so on. And ultimately, it was their patronage of these various cultural and philosophical figures that gave rise to the Pazzi conspiracy. The Pazzis, of course, were highly connected to the Neoplatonic school of Florence, and in fact they were one of the few schools in that time that actually contained the majority of the corpus of Plato, including, of course, in a complete series or complete edition, The Republic by Plato. And they were able to overturn the divine right of the papacy, and later, of course, the Florentine institutions of the Republic as self. Well, without further ado, Legionaries, that concludes Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. I highly recommend this book, just simply as a reading. And there's so much information I could have, extrapolated from, and it really gets you going. It's one of these few books, just like Nietzsche or one of these great Platonic dialogues, that you're able to sit there and just masticate on an idea and see where it takes you, spiraling out of one axis upon many. And that is the essence of great thinking, great writing, and great philosophy, is that it's not simply an end in itself with a prescriptive list, a boorish prescriptive list of petty moralisms, but rather the beginning of many, multifarious, essential character. Well, without further ado, Legionaries, this is Agonia. This is Sergeant Barnes and General Lance, signing off.